I used to work as a park ranger in a fire tower. After that went horribly bad, I got a job working in a warehouse. That also was a disaster. I just wish I would stop finding jobs that have strange rules. I don't go looking for terrifying supernatural happenings. They just seem to find me. The bad part is I need a job if I want to keep living in my office and non-LA dweller begging for food lifestyle. I was looking through the job pages for anything. I was about to apply to a fast food restaurant when my eyes fell on an ad for a night watchman. I was about to pass it up, thinking about the injuries that were still healing after my last night watchman job, when I noticed it was for a wind farm. I had to look up exactly what a wind farm was, and found out it was where they had wind turbines that generated electricity. I saw there was a lot of controversy over environmentalists claiming that wind turbines were the worst thing to ever happen to wildlife. I always thought wind turbines were designed to replace dangerous nuclear power plants and polluting coal and oil ones. I guess you can't please some people. I called the number and was surprised to receive an answer from an actual person rather than an answering machine. The man asked if I could start today. Not could I interview or fill out a bunch of paperwork. If I could start. He didn't even know me. My spidey sense was telling me to beware. He told me the hourly wage, and there was an immediate $500 signing bonus. Greed and need pushed their way to the front of my thoughts, and I agreed to come to the job site. I told him I had some questions. He hesitated but agreed. 25 minutes later, I turned down a gravel road past an open gate with a sign beside it that read, Larson Energy Limited. I pulled next to a building that reminded me of the warehouse where I worked for one day and was nearly killed. I shivered at the thought and hoped this job would turn out much better. I walked up to the door and was nearly run over by a short, round, balding man who appeared to be in his late 40s. His hand was outstretched and shaking mine before the door was completely open. "Are you the one I talked to on the phone?" he said, smiling. "I believe so." "Good," he said. "Come with me. I'll show you around." I followed him to a pickup truck and got in the passenger side. He started it up and headed down a dirt road that was surrounded by trees that were in the general direction of the wind turbines. I stared at them in awe, having never been closer to one than a few miles away. "Impressive, aren't they?" he said, following my gaze. "Very. Just wait until you get beside one." He drove slowly, not going over 20 miles per hour, but the road dictated the speed in general. It had some potholes that were large. I could imagine they would be mini lakes during a heavy rainstorm. "I'm not sure my car would make it through here during bad weather," I said. "Not to worry," he said. "This is a company truck. This is what you'll be driving." "And what exactly would my duties be?" "Exactly what we're doing now," he said, sweeping his arms toward the windshield. "Doing rounds, making sure no one is messing with the turbines." I waited for the rest, for the strange rules, for the catch. That's it, he said. "You'll do 4 rounds a night. You make sure no one is stealing anything or messing around with the turbines. Other than that, you just chase off trespassers." "Whoa. Do you have a lot of trespassers?" I asked. He seemed to hesitate for a moment. "Once in a while, some environmentalists will lurk around, trying to take pictures of birds being hurt by the turbines. They even like to dress up as woodland creatures to scare people." "What do I do if I catch one?" "Take their picture and forward it to the police, that's it." I questioned, "You won't be carrying a gun or anything if that's what you're asking?" "No, I mean, shouldn't I inform you or security?" I asked. "You are security," he told me. I stopped and thought about it for a moment. "Don't worry," he said. "It doesn't happen often." "Is there anything that does happen often?" I questioned him. "What do you mean?" he asked. "Are there any strange rules or anything weird that happens that I should know about?" With that, his eyes grew wider, but he tried to answer calmly. "No," he said with a nervous chuckle. "Of course not." My eyes bored into his, searching for any lies. He looked away, pretending to pay attention to the road. "It's very simple," he said. "Do your rounds, make sure no one trespasses, and you will be fine. You can even bring a portable DVD player if you want, or a book to read. Even use the company Wi-Fi to watch movies on your phone. As long as you do your rounds, no catch." I asked, "No catch?" "No catch," he replied. We had just arrived back at the main building. He parked in front and led me inside to do paperwork and give me a check for the $500 bonus. "Awesome," I said. "When do I start?" He looked at his watch. "Right now," he told me. "Really?" He handed me the keys to the truck. "Go get whatever you need out of your car, and you can start your first round." I looked at my watch as I walked out the door. It was 5 o'clock until 7 o'clock in the evening. I got my water bottle and lunchbox from my car, then headed toward the truck. Another similar pickup pulled into the spot beside me, and a man got out. He was older than me, tall and thin, probably in his 50s. "Are you the new guy?" he said, walking over to me. "I guess so," I said, shaking his hand. "I do the daylight shift," he said. "So, did he tell you everything?" the man asked. "I think so," I said, as the manager came flying through the doors. "No time for chit-chat," he said, chuckling nervously. "Time to make that first round." I looked from him to the other guard. I could tell there was concern on both of their faces. They seemed to be different. The guard turned back toward his truck. "Nice to meet you," he said, getting in his truck and busying himself with something. The manager breathed a sigh of relief and turned away. "Oh, one last thing," he said. "The office door is locked after hours, so if you need any facilities..." He turned around and pointed to a porta potty sitting near the edge of the parking lot. "Understood," I said. "Who do I contact in case of emergency?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, then handed it to me. "Emergencies only," he said. Then he smiled and walked to his car, started it, and drove away. I got in the truck and started it up, nearly having a heart attack when the other guard knocked on the window. "Here," he said, handing me a piece of paper. "You can call or text if you have any trouble." "Thanks," I said, taking the paper. He opened his mouth as if to say something else, then closed it and walked away. I watched as he drove to the gate, got out of his car, closed, and locked it. It didn't have the same feeling of finality as when I was locked in the horrible warehouse, but it was close. Nothing to be afraid of, I told myself, just security measures. I kept telling myself that as I started down the dirt road toward the wind turbines. I drove slowly, wanting to make sure I kept an eye out for anyone, even though the sun hadn't set yet. It was darker on the road as the trees blocked the sunlight. The road was barely a 2-lane, but I didn't think I'd have to worry about any traffic jams out here. I rolled my window down, and the scent of pine filled the truck. I leaned my arm out the window and took a deep breath. The last time I was in a forest like this was the warehouse job, but I didn't get to enjoy the trees. This was like gliding down a river that cut through the middle of a forest. I felt very relaxed. Too relaxed. I had to make sure I stayed awake and didn't drive into a ditch. The birds singing in the trees made me smile. This job turned out to be exactly what I needed. My shoulder twinged, reminding me of my injury, and I brought it back to my side as I drove. The first turbine loomed ahead of me. It was massive. I leaned my head out the window and craned my neck to see the top. The blades weren't moving for some reason. I would have to look that up on my phone when I got back to the parking lot. I stopped to avoid a deer that had wandered out in front of me. It looked at me as though I was intruding on its evening routine. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty," I said to it, "but if you would kindly move, I'll be on my way." It looked at me as if considering my proposition, then flicked its tail and trotted off into the woods. I smiled and continued on down the road. It was still an awesome sight. By the time I passed the third and fourth, I didn't even look up. I just glanced over at the door at the base of the tower to see if anyone was messing with it. The next turbine was missing. I saw a clearing just like all the others, but there was no tower and no turbine. I decided to take a closer look. I put the truck in park and shut it off out of habit. I took the keys with me. There was still enough daylight to see without a flashlight, but just barely. I walked up to where the tower should have been, but all that was there was the base. It was black, and there was debris around it. It was clear that much more debris had been taken away. I didn't see the amount of wreckage I would have expected for a 400-ton tower with a wind turbine on top coming crashing down. As I examined it closer, it seemed like there were a lot of burn marks and melting. I looked around the general area, and there were signs of scorching in the trees and on the ground. I wondered why the boss hadn't mentioned this. I'd never heard of a wind turbine burning up before. I would have thought this would be something worth mentioning to a new security guard. As I was looking around, I heard something move in the trees. It startled me because it would have had to be loud enough for me to hear it over the normal noises of the forest. But then I noticed the normal sounds of the forest were gone. It was eerily quiet. No birds, squirrels, or even insect sounds were audible. I was standing alone in the near dark, surrounded by trees and animals who weren't making any sound. It was like the forest was holding its breath to see what would happen next. My mind was a flurry of thoughts. Are the animals afraid of me? Is this one of those crazy environmentalists? Should I really be standing here exposed, waiting for something to happen? My legs got the message and hightailed it back to the truck as quickly as I could. I rolled up the window, locked the doors, and made a dust cloud from my tires as I left the area a little too quickly. When I got to the next turbine, my adrenaline had bled off, and I was feeling silly for letting myself get scared like that. I slowed to my normal speed and finished my round. The parking lot was empty, so I had my pick of spots. I decided to park close to the porta potty just in case. I settled in and pulled out my phone. Normally I go to YouTube and watch creepypastas, but darkness had finally settled in for the night, and I didn't feel like scaring myself any more than I already had. There were a few security lights in the parking lot near the building and at the far corners, but once I started around, the only light I had was what I took with me. Maybe I could convince the boss to mount one of those strips of LED lights on the front of the truck. This would be one of the few legit reasons to have those. Every time I pass a car or truck on the highway with those lights blinding me, I have the strong urge to get a 1,000,000 candle power spotlight and shine it in their eyes. At least that's what it feels like they're doing to me. I scrolled through Netflix looking for a show to watch. Creatures in the Dark? No. Places you thought were safe? No way. Cryptids of Appalachia? Not even. What is Netflix trying to do to me if I watch Black Mirror? Will it go straight to an episode where a security guard gets horribly mangled in the forest? Comedies. I'll watch The Office. It's not on Netflix. Of course, as soon as I want to watch something, it's gone. Sometimes I wish Blockbuster would have bought Netflix when they had the chance. I opened up my Kindle and read a book. This one looks good. 1-on-1 by Michael Calo, a crime fiction set in a prison. An hour into my book, the alarm on my phone went off. Time for another round. Wow, that went fast. I set the phone aside and checked the glove compartment for a flashlight. Fortunately, one was there. It was one of those fancy ones that was very bright and had strobe flash mode on it. I wondered if I could borrow it to show some of those idiots with the bright LED lights mounted on the front of their trucks. I found myself more on guard this round. The noises of the forest had returned, thankfully. I opened my window a few inches, just enough to let some fresh air and the nightly noises in. The darkness seemed oppressive after the first round being nearly daylight. This time, the world was confined to the two beams of light, fighting the overwhelming shadows of the menacing forest. I found myself going a little faster than last time. It wasn't really a conscious choice, just my subconscious asserting itself once again. When I got to the burnt-out ruins of the wind turbine, the noises ceased. I went a little faster through that area. I thought I saw movement in the tree line headed toward me, but I refused to stop. I justified it by telling myself there was no working turbine here to vandalize. A little rattled, I finished my round quickly, nearly bumping my head on the ceiling of the truck a couple of times from bouncing down the dirt road much faster than I should have. When I came out of the forest, I welcomed the bright lights and relative safety of the parking lot. This time, I parked at the end farthest away from the trees under a security light, just for good measure. As I read my book, my eyes kept darting toward the trees, as if I expected something to jump out at me. I continued to tell myself I was being foolish, but I also kept shooting glances at the trees. When my alarm went off for the next round, it took extra effort to make myself start the truck and aim the headlights toward the trees. The forest had gotten darker and more oppressive. It had also gotten quieter. There were still a few creatures making sounds, but not as many. I told myself most of them had gone to sleep. I only wished I believed it. Even the scent of pine had diminished. It had another scent to it now, the tinge of fear. My eyes darted from one side of the road to the other, taking in as much of my surroundings as possible, which wasn't much with the headlights barely able to cut a path through the suffocating darkness. I nearly jumped out of my skin when a deer walked in front of the truck. I slammed on the brakes, making a dust cloud hover in front of me. The deer glanced at me, then got spooked and ran off. I chuckled to myself at the little bit of revenge of the deer being scared of me, but my chuckle soon turned to chills as the dust cleared and I saw something coming out of the trees. It was big, dark, and covered with fur. Sweat formed on my brow as my mind kicked into gear and my foot mashed the gas pedal. A cloud of dust flew from my rear tires as the truck galloped away. I glanced in my rearview mirror, and to my horror, the creature was running behind me. Even worse, it was gaining. I stepped on the gas, making my speedometer jump and making me ride the seat like a bucking bronco. Thankfully, I had my seatbelt on, or I would have been knocked unconscious by the bigger bumps and ruts, sending my head toward the ceiling. I refused to look back for a long time. When I did, the creature was gone. I breathed a sigh of relief and slowed a little. I was never so happy to see the parking lot. I parked in the same spot at the far end under a light and thought back to my encounter, trying to make sense of it. The creature was huge. It was easily over 7 feet tall and walked on 2 legs. No, ran on 2 legs. It was nearly going 35 miles an hour chasing me. That was the other thing. Why was it chasing me? What did I do to annoy it? Or was it just looking for a midnight snack? Time to get some answers. I got the piece of paper the other guard had given me and typed in the number. Then I sent him a text. I checked my watch, and it was 2:30 in the morning. I didn't really expect an answer, but to my surprise, my phone dinged. I was expecting a message sooner, it said. Why? I replied. Let's just say I don't think the boss told you everything, he texted. Such as? I questioned. You tell me why you messaged first. Okay, have you ever been chased by anything during a round? I asked. Define anything, he replied. Oh, I don't know, like a deer, a bear, a big hairy creature over 7 feet tall walking on its hind legs, I told him. Are you going to quit if I tell you the truth? He asked me. That depends on what the truth is, I said. No, you have to promise not to quit before I tell you, he texted. Why? Because if you quit, I have to go back on the night shift, he told me. And that's a bad thing, I replied. Promise you won't quit, he insisted. I was having flashbacks to my last 2 jobs, being tricked into a horrible situation and then being told what was really going on. I can't promise. I've been burned in my last 2 jobs by strange rules, I told him. Strange rules? He asked. You don't want to know. Sounds like I do, he replied. Then you tell me what's going on here, and I'll tell you what happened in my last 2 jobs. If you promise you won't quit, he reiterated. I'll make you a deal. I'll tell you about my last 2 jobs, and then after that, you tell me if what's happening here is worse. All right, he replied. I told him about my job as a park ranger in a fire tower and as a warehouse guard, about the strange and supernatural things that happened, and how they damaged me mentally and physically. When I was done, he didn't answer right away. That was some story. Is it true? He asked. Those things happened to me, I responded. Well, okay, what's happening here is you're being chased by Bigfoot, he explained. All right, if you don't want to tell me, you don't have to lie, I said, thinking he was joking. I'm not lying. Think about the way you described the creature to me. 7 feet tall, covered in hair, walking on hind legs, he continued. I thought about it for a long moment. Then why is it after me? I asked. He's not exactly after you. He's after whoever patrols the roads, he said. But why? I asked, now confused. Go to a site called Reddit and read the story called I Used to Be the Night Watchman at a Wind Farm. What I saw there still haunts me. After you've read that, if you have more questions, text me, he replied. Okay, I said. I went to the site and read the story. When I was done, I slowly lowered my phone, eyes wide. I texted him back. I've read stories on Reddit before. I always thought they were made up, I wrote. That's what I thought too, he texted back. But if this thing burned up, how is it chasing me? I asked. It's not, he said. I'm confused, I replied. I helped bury the thing. It's dead. What's chasing you is its mate, brother, cousin. Who knows? But some creature with ties to that one. And it's not happy, he explained. And let me guess, it only comes out at night, I texted. Yeah, he replied. I quit, you son of a... I started to write back. You promised, he interrupted. So you'd rather have me die than quit, I asked. You won't die if you stay in the truck, he told me. How do you know? I asked. Because I've been the one doing the night shift, he replied. I thought about it for a long moment. Okay, I've got 1 round left to go. If I make it out without dying, we'll talk about my continued employment. and whatever we agree on, you have to back me with the boss, I told him. Deal, he texted. I started towards the forest. No time like the present. If I'm going to die, might as well get it over with. Right as I pulled into the trees, it felt like I was passing through the gates at Jurassic Park. I hoped I would fare better than they did. The darkness was complete. Only the truck's headlights fought a losing battle, enabling me to see anything at all. When I came near the turbine, I used the flashlight to illuminate the base of the tower to see if anyone was there. Once I was past the turbine, I quickly shut off the light. I had no desire to see anything else. I rolled the window down just enough to hear the nightly noises. When I got to the second turbine, they were silent. I clutched the wheel with white knuckles, waiting to see what would happen. I was so busy looking around for something in the woods that I almost ran into the huge boulder sitting in the middle of the road. That wasn't here before, was my first thought, followed quickly by, it's barricading the road so I can't speed away. The second thought jarred me into action. I turned the wheel hard and swerved around the rock. Fortunately, it hadn't rained in a few days, and there wasn't any soft ground along the side of the road. I stepped on the gas as I rounded the boulder just in time to see another boulder heading straight toward me. I swerved and floored it, fleeing the impact of the rock as it hit the ground beside the truck, missing it by a mere foot. I fishtailed, spewing dirt as the tires fought to gain traction. Once I straightened out, I got as much speed as I could, bumping around so much that I worried about the suspension and the tires. Anything that stopped this truck would be the death of me. I felt pretty good about outrunning the creature when I saw something terrible in front of me. I slammed on the brakes and slid to a stop right in front of two boulders sitting in the middle of the road. They were spaced far enough apart that I couldn't just swerve around. I had to pick a side with more room and go slowly around, nearly scraping the trees as I went. I had just made it around when something crashed into the back of the truck, sending it flying forward. I looked back, and the tailgate was crumpled. There was a boulder lying on the ground beside the other two that hadn't been there a minute ago. I jumped on the gas pedal as another boulder landed right in front of me. I wrenched the wheel to the right, feeling the metal scrape against the side of the truck, but I refused to take my foot off the gas. The scraping got louder, and I knew this was it. He would catch up to me and I would die a horrible death. And then the scraping stopped, and the truck lurched forward. I was free. I built up a little speed and then started swerving back and forth on the road in case he tried to throw another boulder. I counted to 20 before letting off the gas. Sweat dripped from my forehead. I wiped my sweaty hands on my pants. My hands were stiff from holding the wheel so tightly. I kept my speed up, not wanting to give him any chance to catch up to me. As I bounced down the road, I turned a corner and slammed on the brakes. It was impossible. He was standing in the middle of the road in front of me. How could he have gotten here first? He stared at me and bared his teeth. For an instant I thought about turning around, but I was almost to the end of my round, and going back meant guiding my truck through a deadly obstacle course. With nothing left to do, I floored it and drove straight at him. If I'm going to die, I'm going to do my best to take him with me. He stood motionless as I gained speed. Just before I got there, he jumped. I watched as he landed behind the truck and turned on a dime to follow behind. I was gaining speed, but it wasn't enough. I felt a tug, and the truck slowed for a moment. Then the tailgate broke free, leaving him holding the figurative bag. He threw the tailgate at me. I ducked just in time as it smashed through the rear window and kept going through the front windshield. I peeked back only to see him chasing again. I tried to gain more speed. It was difficult, covered in glass, with each bounce in the road now making pieces of glass cut into me. It was also difficult seeing with no windshield to protect my eyes, and pieces of glass flying toward me from the remains of the windshield. I held up my hand to try to shield my eyes. As I did, I noticed I was slowing down. I pressed the gas pedal harder, but seemed to slow even more. I turned to find the creature holding the bed of the truck and digging its feet into the road to slow me down. I got my phone and recorded it, him holding the truck back for a few moments. At least whoever found the destroyed truck would know what happened to me. I resigned myself to my fate. I let off the gas and allowed the truck to stop. He released the back and started climbing into the bed. I was moments from death. I looked down at my phone and pressed record, then grabbed the flashlight, switched it into strobe and shined it in his face. He put his arms up to shield his eyes. I slammed the truck into drive and jumped on the gas. The creature rolled head over heels out of the bed as I sped away. I hit the parking lot doing 45 and nearly crashed into the boss as he drove up to the building. I skidded to a stop and put the truck in park. Right behind the boss was the other guard. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" the boss said, glaring at me. "Surviving," I said as I turned the engine off and tossed him the keys through the missing windshield. For the first time, he noticed the condition of the ruined truck. "What happened to my truck?" he said. "Oh, I don't know," I said sarcastically. "Maybe it was the giant creature chasing me that you neglected to mention." His eyes went wide and his jaw dropped open. "I have no idea what you're talking about," he said, regaining his composure. "I figured you wouldn't," I said as the other guard walked up to us. "Take a look at this." I opened my phone and played the video of the creature pulling the truck to a stop. They both watched in shock until the video ended. I put my phone in my pocket and looked at each of them. "Both of you want me to keep working here, correct?" I asked. They nodded. "Here are my terms. Double the pay, a taser, pepper spray, heavy firearms, and upgraded trucks." "Is that it?" the boss said sarcastically. "No. I want you to hire a cryptid hunter to come in today and capture or kill that thing." The boss's face turned pale. "I have no idea how to get a hold of someone like that." "Those are my terms," I said, standing firm. "Give it to him or I'll quit too," the other guard added. The boss looked back and forth between us, his eyes darting like he was watching a tennis match. "Fine," he shouted, throwing his hands up in the air. "I'll get you what you want." I smiled, shook his hand and walked to my car. "Oh, one more thing," I said over my shoulder. "You might want to have a bulldozer clear the road." The boss looked toward the trees, clearly rattled as I drove away. I prayed he would do everything I asked, because there was no way I could go back out there knowing that thing was waiting for me. I'm posting this as a warning. There are things out there that you don't want to know about. Stay away from them. Don't go looking for them. I'll tell you my story in hopes that it will quench your curiosity. It was a night like any other night. At least lately, I had barely arrived at the ranger station. And there were already 4 calls of vacationers' homes getting broken into out here in the West Virginia Wildlife Preserve. People tend to think that just because they plant some houses that the animals should somehow know and respect boundaries. That's kind of tough when the animals are on a huge plot of land where they've never been hunted and never even been threatened by anything other than a bigger. Animal folk seem to think this is a great vacation spot for them. What they don't realize is it's also a great vacation spot for the animals. I hopped in the company truck and started toward my first destination of the night. An elderly couple had been terrorized by a deer that literally broke in through a sliding glass door. They managed to trap it in a side room and needed someone to go release it. I got elected. When I got there, the vacationers looked like the ones caught in headlights. They were still wide-eyed. I could tell they were in shock. I had them go into another room and close the door. Once they were out of the way, I found the closest door to the outside and opened it. I then went to the room with the deer in it. I slowly opened the door and was shocked to find the room covered in blood the deer was laying on. The floor panting, I approached it slowly, circling around to leave the doorway open, hoping to give it an escape route. The closer I got, the more I realized this deer wasn't going anywhere. Its side was covered with claw marks. At first I thought a coyote had attacked it, but the marks were too far apart. They were large enough to be caused by a bear, but the individual claws were too far apart. I'd never seen anything like this. If I had to compare it to something, I'd say Freddy Krueger sliced it up. The deer's eyes went wide when I approached it, but it didn't jump up and run. I took this as a bad sign. Its breath came in ragged gasps as I struggled to roll it over. Once I did, it was my turn to struggle. Breathing, its entire side was torn to shreds. But that wasn't the worst part. There were large chunks that were missing. I examined the wounds and found bite marks where the missing flesh should have been, but the bites were massive. If it wouldn't have challenged the laws of nature as well as my own sanity, I would have said it was bitten by a shark. Blood poured out of the side and the deer struggled to draw breath. I stood and left the room, leaving the poor creature the dignity of a private death. When I went back in, it was still. I took pictures with my cell phone and tried my best to carry the creature out, without making more of a mess. After I got it loaded on the back of my truck, I went back inside and talked to the vacationers. When I opened the door to the room they were in, the woman's eyes grew wide and she started screaming. The man's eyes were the size of saucers as well. I approached them slowly with my arms outstretched to try to calm them down. It seemed to have the opposite effect. They started climbing the furniture and clawing at the walls to get away from me. I decided to back away and give them some room. "What's wrong?" I asked. The man pointed a shaky finger at me. You are covered in blood," he replied. "The deer got you," the woman said. "You've got rabies or worse," the man said, keeping his distance. "I'm sorry, folks," I said. "This is the deer's blood. You killed it just for breaking in." The woman asked, "What?" "No, it was already injured. I just took it to my truck," I told her. The couple seemed to settle down and consider this. "So you don't have rabies," the man said slowly. "Looking me up and down or anything else?" the woman said, hiding behind her husband. "No, ma'am, I'm fine." She took her turn eyeing me up and down. I assumed looking for wounds, being satisfied. They asked the one question I didn't want to answer. "So what? Killed the deer?" the man asked. "I really don't know," I said truthfully, having just gotten them calmed down. I didn't want to send them back into a panic. "It was probably just a coyote." I said, "A coyote?" the man said, diving back into the pull of panic. "Or a bear," I continued, and failing to calm them. "A bear," the woman cried, diving in after her husband. "You know, folks, you've had a traumatic night," I said. "I can't tell you what to do, but if I were you, we're leaving," the woman said, dragging her husband out of the room. "That sounds like a good idea," I said, and then like an idiot I added, "I hope you enjoyed your stay." They either didn't hear me or ignored me. Either way, wasn't long until I heard a car start, then roar away from the house. I went back into the room, where the deer had been trapped, and started working backwards from there, trying to find out what had happened. It wasn't hard to pick up the trail. It had been bleeding badly. Seeing the bites and claw marks made that fairly obvious. I tracked back through the kitchen and out the smashed glass door. Once outside, I turned on my flashlight. The trail was a little harder to follow, but not much. I could still see drops of blood besides its tracks as I followed them back toward the pond. Behind the house, I approached the pond and saw signs of a struggle. This must have been where the deer was attacked. There were other tracks in with the deers, but they didn't make sense to me. They were large, too large. Their shape was odd as well. If I had to call them anything, I would have called them duck prints, but massive, larger than any ducks. By many times a giant duck with shark teeth. I think I'll leave. That out of my report, I thought. It suddenly struck me what the tracks were. It was a man with swim fins on his feet. But why could while that trouble to poach a deer when you can just knock it out with the tranquilizer gun? My mind sent me an answer, but I didn't like it. What if that man is a psychopath, just getting his kicks by killing an animal with his bare hands? Thought about the mental hospital in the neighboring county, and wondered if one of their patients had taken an unsanctioned leave of absence and they were trying to keep it quiet. I didn't like that thought one bit. Aside from the fact that it didn't explain the huge bites on the deer, it also meant we had someone who might suddenly get a taste for killing. Doing this to animals was horrible. But what if he decided to go after something bigger? I shot a look at the house, wondering how many vacationers were within a short walk from this spot and how many were armed. As I contemplated the safety of the people in the area, I heard something behind me. I whipped around and shone my flashlight, but I saw nothing. I scanned the pond and saw a ripple emanating from the middle, probably just a fish jumping. I took some more pictures of the struggle area with my phone, then started back toward my truck. I had more calls to answer, and this riddle would have to wait. I drove halfway around the lake, around 3 miles, to the other vacation home where a break-in had been reported. When the woman in her 30s answered the door, she took her a step back. "Oh my," she said, looking at the dried blood all over my uniform. "Good evening, ma'am. Sorry about my appearance," I said. "Did you report a break-in?" "Yes, we did. Please come in," she said in a friendly tone, yet gave me a white berth. While closing the door, she led me upstairs to the kitchen. For some reason, I was expecting to find blood all over, like with the last house. However, this was a completely different mess. She showed me the door. It had been forced open, but not shattered like the last one. There was only a small amount of glass broken. Then the door latch had been unlocked and the door slid open. There were faint images of my giant duck tracks like the last house. My spine turned to ice. This house was over 3 miles away from the other. There were many more people in that space that might have fallen victim to this crazed person. The woman showed me the rest of the kitchen, and the mess that had been left there were a few cans of sardines that had been opened and eaten, and also some cans of tuna fish. The strange thing was how they were opened. The cans had been torn into with something sharp, but not a can opener. The marks looked like they were torn open with claws. I shut-uted to imagine the amount of strength it took to do something like that, and then I spotted it. Beside one of the cans of tuna was a small puddle of blood. "Ma'am, could I trouble you for a sandwich bag?" I asked. She handed me one, and I carefully tried to scrape as much blood into it as possible. I sealed it and put it in my pocket, then went out through the broken door behind the house. Just like with most of these vacation houses, there was a small pond. I traced the tracks back to it, and they disappeared at the waterline. I shone my light over the water, but the only thing I saw was a straight turtle. I stared at it for a long time, as I thought it would somehow give me a clue as to what was going on. "What should we do?" the woman said, nearly scaring me half to death. I hadn't heard her follow me out the door and into the yard. "I'll send someone around to look at that door in the morning," I said. "In the meantime, it might not be a bad idea to sleep in a room that has a lock on the door. I'm sure they won't be back," but just in case, she didn't seem very confident by that idea, but thanked me as I left the next two. Reports were just teenagers breaking in and stealing beer. That was it. No bloody wildlife, no weird tracks. Just kids being kids. I went back to the station, changed out of my bloody uniform, and spent the rest of my night filling out reports on what had happened. When my shift was over and I passed on what had happened, I took a little trip to the neighboring county. I stopped in at the mental hospital and asked if they had any escapes lately. The nurse looked at me like I'd asked her if she was wearing deodorant. "We don't have escapes," she said with obvious pride that showed her arrogance. I thanked her and left, feeling less than satisfied with her answer. Next, I stopped in at the local police department and asked one of my friends on the force if they could analyze the blood sample for me. I shared my thoughts that there might be an escapee from the mental hospital, and the blood sample might help us find out who and track him down. It was well past noon before I got to bed that night. When I got to work, it was pandemonium. There had been more break-ins, and people were starting to panic. The owner of the resort was frantic. People were cancelling left and right, wanting their money back. When I walked in, he stormed his pudgy face right up to mine. "You told people to go home," he fumed, glaring up at me. "I merely suggested..." "Do you want to pay for the rental out of your salary?" "I work for the state, not you," I said. He turned a deeper shade of red. "Would you rather see people in body bags instead of animals?" I said. "That wouldn't do much for business now, would it?" He turned fire engine red and stormed out, mumbling, "We'll see." I investigated 5 break-ins that night. Only 2 of them were legit. The rest seemed like half-hearted attempts to stage a break-in so they could get out of paying for their rental. The 2 real ones shared the same characteristics as before, just enough of a broken window to open the door, and cans of whatever seafood was available: shrimp, tuna, and even sardines taken. Everything about the way the intruder acted pointed to a person. All I needed to know was who. Again, I followed the tracks back to the nearby pond. I stood there for a long time, studying the surface of the water. I knew these ponds were all designed the same, a roughly 40-yard by 40-yard body of water, around 5 feet deep in the middle, stocked with mostly bluegill for catch and release fishing. Anyone using these ponds to hide would have to be holding their breath for inhuman periods of time. I stared at the surface for 20 minutes. If someone was out there, they had an invisible snorkel or an extra set of lungs. After my rounds of investigating and reporting, I decided to stick around and do a little extra investigating. I ran home, grabbed my swim trunks, mask and snorkel, and went to the site of the most recent break-in. I waded out into the water, unsure of what I would find. When a snake slithered past me, I let it go and waded deep enough to where I could swim. I hovered at the level of the surface, dipping my mask underwater to get a glimpse of whatever there was to see. There wasn't much. Fish, underwater plants, and obviously lots of water. Just what you would expect from a pond. As I kept going towards the middle, the water was getting deeper. I now couldn't touch the bottom and had to float on the surface. Looming in front of me was a dark spot at the bottom of the pond. I took it for a rock, but swam close enough to investigate anyway. In for a penny. In for a pound. As I drew close enough to hover over it, I realized it wasn't a rock. I took a deep breath and dove to find out what it was. The further I swam down, the further I was able to swim. I kept going and going. Light disappeared. I was sure I'd been swimming straight down for a solid minute without touching the bottom. I turned and looked up. The surface of the pond was only a pinprick of light. My lungs screamed at me to turn around. I had no choice but to comply. I clawed at the water in desperation. It seemed like I was swimming in mud, or something was pulling me down, almost like a force or current pushing against me, wanting me to drown before I could fully explore this hidden secret. After what felt like an eternity, I broke the surface of the water and gasped for air. I swam over to the shallows and walked out of the pond. I collapsed on the shore and lay there for a long time, trying to regain my breath. As my brain received oxygen, I thought about what had happened and whether it had been real, an illusion, or if I'd just gotten turned around somehow and stuck at the bottom. I had to find out. I wasted no time driving 2 counties over and renting some diving equipment along with a light. So armed, I returned to the pond and walked toward the middle again. This time, when I dove toward the dark spot, I was able to see exactly what it was. I used the flashlight to examine the darkness as I swam deeper. The sides closed in on me as if I was swimming down the gullet of some massive fish. I'd never been claustrophobic before, but that was rapidly changing. I barely had any room to maneuver as the sides closed in. I contemplated turning around, but there was no room. I could feel myself starting to panic. I had to focus to keep my breaths regular. I was very close to a panic attack when suddenly the tunnel opened up again. The sides grew further apart. I checked my watch. I'd been under for 15 minutes. The sides of the tunnel had spread out so far they were barely visible, and I could see a light ahead of me. I swam toward it, desperate to get out of this water. I broke through the surface and looked around. I was in a pond. Somehow I had gotten turned around and was back in a pond. I swam to the side until I could stand and walked out to the shore. Looking around me, I made a startling discovery. I was in a different pond, the same one as the break-in last night. Somehow, there was a hidden tunnel between the 2 ponds. That's how the robber never gets caught. He just swims to the next pond, slick as snot. No fuss, no muss. I now knew the how, but I needed to know more. As tempting as it was to swim back through the tunnel, I was still a little shaken and didn't want to risk an underwater panic attack. I walked back to my truck, took off my diving equipment, and drove back to the dive shop. I asked about frequent customers, especially for refilling tanks. They told me they had a few regulars that came in every weekend, but no one knew and no one who needed refills more than once a week. I asked if there were any other dive shops in the area, and they told me the next closest one was over 100 miles away. I went home frustrated. It wasn't making sense. He would need air to swim back and forth through that tunnel, and that was his escape route. I was sure of it. I tried to sleep through the afternoon, but my mind wouldn't let me rest. It was working on the impossible puzzle of how the robber was getting air. I borrowed a couple of trail cams and set one up at each pond. I needed to see if he had some new tank system or what. I also wanted to identify him and shut him down fast. I made sure to stay away from those ponds that night so he would feel free to do his thing. In the morning, I gathered the cameras and took them home. I downloaded both memory cards before watching the video. Just as the second download was finished, my phone rang. "Hello," I answered. "Hey John, it's Steve. I got the results from that blood you gave me the other day." "Great," I said, hitting the play button on my computer. "Were you able to get a match on any hospital records?" "Not exactly," Steve said. "Why not?" I asked as a ghostly green image appeared on my computer. The image was blurred, but it was definitely the size of a man walking upright toward the camera. I clicked to the next slide and froze at what I saw. Well, the thing is, the blood you gave me came back as reptile DNA. I registered the words he said in my mind, just like I registered the image on my computer screen, but I just couldn't place them in reality. "Are you there?" Steve said into the phone. "Yeah, I'm sorry," I said. "Could you send a copy of your findings to my office?" I asked. "Sure, no problem." "Thanks, I appreciate it. You really helped me figure this out." "Anytime," he said cheerfully before hanging up. I hadn't taken my eyes off the computer screen the whole time. No matter how long I stared at it, I couldn't make my mind acknowledge it was real. Standing there, large as life, was not a man in a wetsuit. It was a creature. I could see the mouth, wide, full of sharp teeth that looked exactly like the bites on the deer. I could see the webbed feet that looked like swim fins, only they had claws sticking out of the front where the toes would be. I saw the razor-sharp claws on its webbed hands. It was a full-on nightmare staring me in the face. I sat back and thought for a long time. Then I printed copies of the images and put them in an envelope. I rushed to the station to share the information I had with my fellow rangers. As I was showing them the pictures, their faces ranged in emotions from shock to disbelief to outright mocking. While I was going through my investigation, the owner of the timeshares walked in. "What are we all looking at?" he said, eyeing me with contempt. "It seems like John has solved the case of the break-ins," one of the other rangers said. The owner approached and picked up the lab report, reading it over with a puzzled expression. Then he glanced at the picture I had printed, and his eyes went wide. "Do you know what this is?" he said absently. "I really don't know yet," I replied. "I've never seen anything like it." He turned to me, smiling. "This is money," he said, holding up the picture. "What do you mean?" I asked, confused. "Those idiots that go around hunting, what do they call them?" "Cryptids," he said, his grin growing wider. "Yeah, cryptids," I helped. "They'll pay through the nose if they think they can find something like this. And then there's the TV shows, the merchandising," he continued, eyes gleaming with excitement. "You may have just saved my financial hide," he beamed at me. "I don't think you understand," I said, feeling a knot of dread in my stomach. "This is a dangerous animal. If you had seen what it did to that deer—" "So what? You want to hunt it down and kill it?" he interrupted, his tone dripping with disbelief. "Maybe not kill it, but definitely tranquilize it and take it to a secure location where it can't hurt anyone," I argued, trying to get him to see reason. "You dumb son of a," he shouted, his face flushing with anger. "I could make a mint. I wouldn't even have to repair those houses. They would all rush in to investigate and leave piles of cash in my bank account. And you want to flush it down the toilet because you're scared someone might break a nail?" He was breathing hard, staring up into my face. The air between us was charged with fury, his and mine, and then a sudden calm came over him, which made me even more uneasy. "Charles," he said, addressing the lead ranger who had been quietly observing the whole time, "isn't this a wildlife preserve?" "Yes, it is," Charles said wearily, as if he already knew where this was going. "And aren't the wildlife on this preserve protected from all tampering by law?" "Well, I guess so," Charles replied reluctantly. "What if those animals present a threat?" I said to Charles, trying to steer the conversation back to reality. "How many deer were killed by coyotes on this preserve last year?" "Dozens," Charles answered. "Were the coyotes removed from the preserve?" the owner continued, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "No," Charles replied. The owner turned to me, a smug look on his face. "See, this is nature, John. It happens. Animals die and we don't interfere." "This isn't a normal animal," I said, frustration building in my voice. "What happens when this thing decides it likes to eat humans?" Suddenly, the room became very quiet. All the eyes that had been on me suddenly found somewhere else to look, all but the owner, who was still grinning from ear to ear like he'd just won the lottery. I think the pudgy little bastard was about to break into a happy dance right in front of me. I searched the room for any support, but found none. Everyone was either too afraid to speak or unwilling to go against the owner. I quietly pulled my badge off my shirt, laid it on the desk, and left without saying another word. If that was the end of my story, I would say I had failed. I took my pension and rented one of the houses on the preserve. The owner had leaked through social media that a cryptid had been spotted on the preserve, and, as he guessed, cryptid hunters and TV crews came in droves, renting everything in sight. My goal was different. I already knew it existed, and I knew how it got around without being detected. I stayed at one of the break-in houses. Every night I took a huge tuna I bought fresh that morning and laid it out beside the pond. Then I sat in the dark living room and watched. The first night, the creature approached, stepping cautiously toward the fish. After sniffing it for a long time, it grabbed it and dove into the pond. Each night after that, I laid out a fish, and the creature became less cautious. It was being fed, and the media frenzy was starving. The hunters found nothing. There were no sightings. As long as I fed it, everyone else was safe. Everyone had their cameras set up, but the few hunters who roamed around left me alone when they saw someone in the house. I guess they thought I was another cryptid hunter and respected my privacy. As the number of sightings stayed at 0, people started leaving. In desperation, the owner did the wrong thing. He hired an actor to dress in a creature suit and roam around. Of course, the hunters and TV crews saw right through it and destroyed what was left of his reputation. I had rented the house for 2 weeks. Between the rent and the fish, my money was running out. I had kept the people safe, but what would happen when I stopped feeding it? I had managed to clear out most of the people so they would be safe. But what about my fellow rangers? What would happen when the creature became desperate? When it no longer had houses full of food to break into? I had 3 more nights until I had to leave. I was out of money. The preserve had become a ghost town. As far as I knew, I was the only renter left. It was decision time. I sat staring at the large tuna on the table with a bottle of bleach next to it. Let it live and see what happens, or kill it. I thought about this for a long time. Both options had their merits and consequences, but I chose a third option, a much more dangerous one. I took the fish out and laid it where I usually did. I then backed up a few feet and stood there. Over an hour passed before the water stirred. I saw the head and eyes of the creature appear as it headed toward the fish. Then it stopped. It had seen me. I made sure to keep still with my arms at my side. It slowly approached and stood a few feet away from me, with the fish in between us. It studied me and sniffed the air. Then it became agitated, perhaps smelling my scent from before as a pursuer. It let out a soft hiss, but bent down and took the fish, keeping its eyes on me the entire time. Once it had its meal, it did the most incredible physical display I'd ever seen. It leapt 20 feet into the air and landed in a perfect dive right in the middle of the pond, leaving almost no splash. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and collapsed to the ground, shaking. Once I'd recovered, I went back inside and fell into a fitful sleep. That was only part of my plan. The next night would decide who lived and who died. I did exactly like the night before, minus the fish. The creature approached, stepped up to me and looked around for the fish. I showed it empty hands. It sniffed at them and growled, having smelled the scent of fish. It looked at my hands, and I wondered if it was going to bite them off as a substitute. It hissed at me and sniffed at my face. I saw it flexing its claws the whole time. I stared into its face, those massive razor-sharp teeth, and swallowed hard. I did all I could to stay still, to show it I wasn't a threat. My heart hammered in my chest. It opened its jaws and showed me those horrible teeth. Its breath was a horrid stench I had never smelled before and hoped to never smell again. I closed my eyes, not knowing if they would ever open again. Seconds fell into minutes. I opened my eyes and I was alone. There wasn't even a ripple in the water. I sighed. My decision had been made. It had shown restraint, and I would too. I went back inside, packed, and left. I could only hope and pray that the people who remained, including my former co-workers, would be safe. The next morning there was a report in the newspaper of a break-in at a wildlife preserve. They said the only thing that was taken was cans of tuna fish. I smiled ruefully and wondered how long it would stay that way. If you're reading this, don't go looking for this thing. If you see it, don't tell others about it. Just leave it alone and hope for the best. When I was younger, I was a big fan of urban exploration. My best friend at the time was too, and she knew all the best spots and all the rules for safe exploring. Some of the rules were pretty obvious. Wear tennis shoes and tall socks. Wear something you can move quickly and freely in. Take a flashlight and a bottle of water. Some of the rules were more subtle, learned through years of trial and error. This story is about one of those rules, and how I insisted on learning it the hard way. Nikki, my friend, was and still is one of the smartest people I've ever known, which means she was also the best person for me to get into urban exploring with. Not only did she know all the best places, but I trusted her so completely I would do what she said without argument, most of the time. After our adventures exploring an abandoned Macy's, an old barn, and several spur-of-the-moment road trips, Nikki told me there was somewhere special she wanted to go. She wouldn't tell me anything about it until we got there, which was unusual, but only made me more excited to see whatever it was. I remember the first time I visited that place with her. It was late summer, when the leaves haven't started to turn yet, but you can feel the first cold spark in the air that promises the seasons are right about to change. One of the things I liked about exploring with Nikki was that she always drove us, so I got to sit in the passenger seat and watch the scenery pass us by. That day we drove out into the hills on the outskirts of town, passing neighborhoods, then houses, then fields with the occasional house, then nothing but trees, fields, and hills. I memorized the route we took, some part of me knowing already that I would want to return to this place. I wish I wasn't so good at memorizing directions. We had stopped for coffee before making our way out of town, and we laughed and sang along loudly to the music on the radio as she drove. After a long time, Nikki pulled the car off to the side of the road, parked in an area that had no discernible markers as far as I could tell, and said with a grin, "We're here." I stepped out of the car and breathed in deeply, savoring the scent of tall grass, old growth trees, and rotting wood. I looked around at the tall pines and lovely aspens, then smiled at Nikki. I said, "All right, I'm not sure this one qualifies as urban exploration, but it's a nice spot." Nikki smirked and tossed her long curly brown hair over her shoulder. "I guess it's not urban, no, but you're really going to like this." I followed her as we walked through the woods. There was no path, and I wasn't entirely sure there ever had been. It looked and felt like no one had ever been out here except for us. I had a brief moment of fear, remembering all those stories about people snapping and sacrificing their friends or classmates to Slenderman, then shook it off. After a few minutes of hiking over dead trees, through tall grass, and past strange detritus, I'm pretty sure I saw an old wagon completely overgrown with weeds at one point. I saw a structure not too far from us, partly obscured by the trees. Nikki pointed to the structure and said, "There it is." Just past a small river, hidden in the line of trees, was a miniature version of an old Victorian house. At one point in time, it had been painted pink and blue. The trim around the windows had probably been white, and my inner child fell in love with it instantly. In a hushed, almost reverent tone, I asked, "What is it?" Nikki gave me her most pleased smile, the expression she reserved for our best discoveries, and whispered back, "It's an old playhouse. I'm guessing some rich guy had it built for his daughters ages and ages ago. It's beautiful, in kind of an unsettling way, right?" I nodded. It was beautiful in an unsettling way. There was something about it that made me feel like I would hear children's voices, or see a little girl dart out from behind it at any moment. The playhouse was at least 2 stories from what I could tell, and made of wood and stone rather than plastic. The paint was chipping off, the roof was caving in, and most of the glass windows were broken. I was entranced, and began walking towards it, sure Nikki would know the best way to cross the river to get to it, but she grabbed my arm and pulled me back. All she said was no. I laughed. "What do you mean? We came all the way out here and you don't want to go look at it?" She shook her head, an abnormally serious expression on her usually cheerful face. "We can stay on this side of the river and look at it, but we're not going over there." I chuckled again, but I was starting to get frustrated. "We can wade through the river if there's no bridge or anything. I promise I'll stand right next to your car until I'm dry if you don't have any towels." Nikki had learned the hard way to always keep a towel in the trunk of her car. She let go of my arm but took a step back. "Mara, look around. Do you see beer bottles anywhere? Cigarettes? Soda cans? Candy wrappers?" I looked around at the ground, noting in surprise that I didn't see anything of the kind. "No, I guess whoever owns this land maintains it really well." Nikki said, Nobody maintains it. It's just that no one wants to be out here for very long. If teenagers won't party here, then we shouldn't explore either. There's a reason no one wants to get close to that thing. We can admire from a distance, but we don't need to cross the river. Just trust me, okay? I couldn't. I had always trusted her implicitly, and it had always been a good call. But this time I just couldn't understand why she was refusing to let me look closer at this amazing little discovery. We stood there in the field arguing about it for a few more minutes, until Nikki finally threatened to abandon me there if I took one more step closer to the old playhouse. Of course I had to take another step towards it, and she immediately turned around and started back towards the car, ready to make good on her promise. I laughed and chased after her, saying, "I was kidding, I'm kidding." She kept walking, not stopping until we made it back to the car, but I could tell she wasn't really angry with me. We brushed ourselves off, checked each other for ticks, another rule she learned the hard way, then got back in the car and went to the mall. When Nikki dropped me off at my house later that day, she looked me in the eyes and said, "I was serious, Mara. If there's no sign of humans around a clearly man-made structure, that's a good sign you need to be careful." I smiled, but I couldn't meet her eyes as I said, "Yeah, of course, I got you." I could tell she didn't feel good about it, but she went home anyway. I spent the next few weeks thinking about the playhouse non-stop. I had taken a few pictures of it, and I spent all my time looking at them, zooming in and out and studying the structure as if I was going to take a test on it. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore, and on one warm fall Saturday I got in my car and traced our route back to the old playhouse. It was a lot harder to find alone, and I had to drive back and forth on the road for a while before I found the spot where I thought we had parked the last time. It was mid-afternoon, and the first thing I noticed when I got out of my car was the total lack of sound. There were no birds singing, no small animals rustling in the underbrush. Nothing. I couldn't remember if I had heard animals or not when I came here with Nikki, but I pushed on despite my unease. I walked through the brush and tall grass for a while before I finally saw the playhouse in the distance. I had imagined that scene in my head in the days leading up to it, and I had expected to feel elation. Instead, I felt a vague unease as storm clouds gathered in the distance. I told myself it was just my brain fooling me because of the storm clouds, and pushed on. When I got to the river, I walked up and down the banks a bit, looking for a log or some boards to cross on. There was nothing, which only made me think of Nikki's warning about avoiding places other people didn't want to be. I scoffed. Maybe that was the best place to be. For once, Nikki didn't know what she was talking about. After a few minutes, I was able to locate a fallen log and slide my way across it carefully. I almost tripped at one point and felt my heart rate increase dreadfully, despite how shallow the water below was. I told myself it was just because I didn't want to get in my car wet, or bother with washing the car towel Nikki had insisted I get. But something in my head screamed for me to turn back. When I stood in front of the playhouse, it all felt worth it. Despite the peeling paint, chipping wood, and cracked glass, there was an odd and distinct beauty to the old place. It reminded me of a dollhouse I'd had as a kid. I stood there in the woods for a long time, just admiring it before I got up the courage to go closer. I snapped a picture and sent it to Nikki, but there was no cell service. When I finally entered the structure, the first thing I noticed was the simple wooden floor, and how clean it was aside from some dirt and grass and a few small piles of leaves. That may not sound very clean, but if you've been in a lot of abandoned structures, you'll know what I mean. That's not just unusual, it's bizarre. I glanced up and saw that there was a small hatch in the ceiling with a simple rope ladder hanging down. The rope had frayed in the middle on one side and slightly higher up on the other, so it was cut and dangling. I put one hand on it and tugged, then decided it wasn't sturdy enough to support my body weight. Part of me was kind of proud of myself, even though I hadn't listened to Nikki when she asked me not to explore this place. I was still using her safety lessons. I figured if this went well, I could try and convince her to come back with me so she could see the place for herself. I snapped more pictures from the inside, the walls, the ceiling, the broken windows. After a moment, I noticed something in the pile of leaves and walked closer to investigate. It was a child's teacup set, perfectly intact and made from porcelain. I walked towards it like I was in a dream, and when I got there, noticed the wooden slats on the wall leading up to another hatch in the ceiling. I tested them, pushing down with one foot while I braced against the wall. When I told Nikki about it later, she said I should have used my hand or a stick instead in case the wall collapsed. And when I had determined they were sturdy enough to hold me, I began to climb. When I got to the second floor of the playhouse, I nearly fell back to the ground floor in shock. Propped in one corner was a life-size doll of a man. It had a cloth body and porcelain head and hands. The face looked angry, with painted-on eyebrows and bright pink lips pulled down in a grimace, but the eyes looked more pained or afraid than angry. It was horribly unsettling, and I had to take a few minutes clinging to the wooden slats to catch my breath. After a moment, I realized I was hanging on pieces of rotting wood at least 8 to 10 feet up from the ground, and I scrambled onto the floor. The room was small, probably 6 feet across in either direction, and this room had more detritus in it. I saw scraps of what looked like fancy children's dresses among the wreck from the roof having caved in. I couldn't tell for sure how old the playhouse was, but years of snow, wind and rain had clearly taken a toll. There were boards and shingles all over the floor, and when I glanced up at the ceiling, I could see only a few structural beams, and only trees and sky beyond that. I looked back down at the floor and felt a little snake of worry wriggling in my stomach. If teenagers won't party here, then we shouldn't explore either. I shoved down my worry and kicked out at the crumbling wood beams on the floor, wanting to move them so I could see what was underneath. The smiling face of a little girl looked back at me from under the rubble, and I screamed, stumbling backwards and landing in the lap of the life-size doll. It wrapped its arms around me and I screamed even harder, then burst into tears of relief when I realized the arms had just fallen on me. I crawled away from the doll and laid on the floor for a moment, alternating between laughing and crying until I felt something touch my ankle. It was a soft touch, so gentle I told myself I could pretend it didn't happen, but my stupid head turned of its own volition, looking down at my own foot almost accusingly. A tiny, soft hand rested gently on my ankle, and I allowed my eyes to follow the hand up to the wrist, to the elbow, to the shoulder, and then to the tiny, smiling face. I stared at it in horror, trying to process what I was seeing. There in the rubble was a little girl. She was the size of a very small child, and her skin was shiny and white like porcelain, but moved like regular skin. Her hair was pitch black and her eyes were a shiny, happy blue. She stroked my ankle gently and asked, "Do you want to be my friend?" I don't know any other way to say this, but her voice was like porcelain too, delicate, bright, and oddly ethereal. I jerked my ankle away and crawled backwards like a crab, trying to put some distance between us. As soon as I did, her face fell, and for a moment I felt like the world's biggest monster. I said, I just want to go. I'm sorry, I shouldn't be here." Big tears welled up in her eyes as she said, "You don't want to play with me?" I was at a loss. On the one hand, a little girl had just crawled out of the rubble of a broken-down old playhouse in the middle of nowhere and was stroking my ankle like a creepy guy at a bar. On the other hand, apparently all she wanted was someone to play with, and I felt like kind of a massive jerk saying no to such a sweet request. I also felt like a massive fool for feeling bad instead of running away. I edged backwards again and she asked, "Are you scared of me?" She slowly started crawling out of the rubble, revealing an equally doll-like body and strangely pristine pink, white and blue dress. Instead of crawling towards me, she pulled herself up and walked over to the life-size doll on the floor. She pressed her hand to its cheek lovingly, and the doll's eyes flew open, revealing the real human eyes under the painted porcelain-looking ones. I screamed and the doll opened its porcelain mouth as if to scream too, but the girl ripped her hand away and the face went back to a painted porcelain mask. She said, "Daddy was always scared of me too." That was more than I could handle, and I threw myself down the open shaft with the rope ladder, giving myself some nasty rope burn as I used it to try and break my fall. I stumbled, fell, and heard a tiny porcelain voice say, "Don't run away. I'll have to make Daddy chase you." I decided to take that bet and sprinted out the door and through the shallow water, not stopping until I got back to my car. I fumbled the keys once, twice, before managing to get them in the door to unlock it, already sobbing in terror and relief as I slid in and locked the door behind me. I looked up to see a little girl holding the hand of the life-size doll, its head rolling limply on its shoulders, and I threw the car in reverse and backed out onto the road. I made it all the way home before I realized my cell was missing. It must have fallen out of my pocket when I ran away from the house. It was only a few hours before Nikki showed up at my house, looking pale and angry. She hugged me tightly and said, "What the hell, Mara? You went back without me." I burst into tears all over again and had to pull myself together to explain what had happened. When I was done, she said, "I don't think I'd be able to believe that story if you didn't look so scared right now. Did you take anything before you went out there?" I shook my head. I was stone cold sober, Nick. She nodded vaguely, just as her phone buzzed. She held it up to show that the message had come from my old number, the phone I had lost in the woods. I watched as she opened it up and showed me a picture of my car driving away from the playhouse. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed that. If you have a scary story you'd like me to read on the channel, please send me an email or post it to my subreddit. You can find details of this in the video description. It's the stories that make this channel, and this is the best way to ensure variety in the stories I share. Thank you all for listening, and a special thanks to my channel members and patrons, who now have special access to ad-free videos and other behind-the-scenes content. Once again, thank you guys for listening. Have a great night.